Well, welcome everyone. Good morning, or good evening, or depending on what time it is over wherever you guys are at. Welcome to the technical support training for Crown. This is part 1 of 2. Today we're mostly just going to go over some of the basics and what to expect, but let's get into it. So let's cover our primary objectives for today. First and foremost, this is a knowledge sharing opportunity. I am one of 2 technical support leads for the Crown Audio brand. I've been with Harman since January of 2018. And previously to that, I was a field integration and service technician for about 11 years. Since joining Harman, I've run across a lot with the Crown brand, and I can tell you that we are still learning new things every single day. So hopefully we can just kind of all get on the same page, and you guys will know what I know. I can't teach you everything. There simply isn't enough time. Crown is kind of huge, and audio in general is kind of huge. So, but hopefully we can get to a basic understanding of what to expect during a technical support case, and what you should be looking out for. One of our goals is response consistency. We should all be answering the same types of questions the same ways. That is going to vary from person to person, technician to technician, but the idea is still consistency, which brings us to our third objective, which is TSE confidence, confidence in answering pre-sale and post-sale questions, whether that's troubleshooting, configuration, setup, or pre-sale questions, amp selection, power issues, or power questions. For post-sale, the configuration and setup, that's mostly going to be in session 2, where we will go do more of a deep dive into each particular amplifier brand and family, and talk about what kind of issues and questions are common to each particular amp. If you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. You can also do the raise your hand thing if you want to speak up, but if you put them in chat, I'll go ahead, I'll keep my eye on that and try to answer them as they come along. There will also be another Q&A section right at the end where you guys can, we'll open up the mics and everyone can talk and ask their questions live. So it's important to go into brand history and talk about who Crown is, who we are. Crown was founded in Elkhart in 1947 by one Clarence C. Moore as the International Radio and Electronics Corporation. It was later named to Crown by his wife, Ruby, who thought that International Radio and Electronics Corporation was just way too long to say. I think she wasn't wrong. It became Crown because the Crown emblem was what they had as an emblem on most of the tape recorders. They actually started as a tape recorder company and broadcasting company. Clarence Moore was actually a missionary who would visit various South American countries and Central American countries, preaching the Christian gospel. And when he came back to the U.S., he wanted to start a company that could produce some reliable recording and broadcasting equipment. The product that actually put Crown on the map was actually a tape recorder that had a 15-watt integrated amplifier built into it. That was actually pretty groundbreaking at the time, because there was nothing on the market like it. Next, in 1964, we have the advent of the DC300, which is actually probably our most popular amp of all time. It was the first Class A, B plus B amplifier, a solid state design, super reliable, very, very clean. We have, I think it's in the Technology Hall of Fame actually right now. 1971, there was actually a fire at the Crown manufacturing facility. It burned about $1 million worth of uninsured assets, but they were able to rebuild in about 6 weeks and get the D60 amplifier out, which was pretty cool because that was another one of our major revolution or major products or major releases that kind of made Crown what it is today. In 2000, Crown was purchased by Harman International. Harman actually only purchased the audio division of the company, including amplifiers and microphones. The Crown microphones are mostly supported by AKG, so we won't really go into those, but it's still good to know about it. There actually is still a broadcast portion of Crown that is not owned by Harman. So far, I really haven't had any questions or people accidentally calling in about that, but they are still out there. So keep your mind out, keep your mind on that. Just every once in a while, we get questions from other companies or people thinking that Crown is another company. So if that ever happens, then yeah, there is a Crown broadcast, and they actually sell broadcast amplifiers for radio stations. Crown currently makes about $130 million a year in U.S. revenue, so a pretty big company. And we also have a reputation for reliability. Most Crown amps will easily last about 10 years of everyday use. So they bring a great value to anyone who purchases one. We are used in almost any application you can think of for audio, including like large venue like stadiums, cinema. There's touring applications like your large bands, restaurants, retail, grocery, public address and DJ stuff, fitness studios, residential landscaping and home systems, home theater systems. Although I should put a caveat on the residential stuff because Crown only produces professional equipment rather than commercial or consumer equipment. And we'll talk about why that's important a bit later. Okay. Let me go ahead and put some links in the chat as we go along. Go. Actually, I should back up here for a second. So the reason why it says move over chickens and stuff is heavy because in 1947, when he started Crown, it was actually started out of a chicken coop that was converted to a manufacturing facility, essentially. But I don't want to confuse anyone with the title, so let's go ahead and move on. So to get started, we have to begin to start with the basics because the majority of our troubleshooting calls and most of our calls really kind of boil down to that. Audio is kind of a beast, so it's easy to overlook things if you don't start from the beginning each and every time. Even a 20+ year veteran of the audio industry is going to make mistakes and or have problems if they skip the basics, and they're going to be prone to overlooking something that's relatively simple. I mean, it happens all the time where I get calls where people say, "Hey, I've been doing this for 40 years." And you tell them something very simple and they kind of slap their forehead thinking, duh, but we can't skip that stuff. So to start, if you try asking someone a troubleshooting step and they say they've already tried it like before you called, don't be afraid to ask them to try it again while you're on the phone with them. And have them talk you through each actual step. So say, yeah, I'm unplugging the amplifier right now, or I'm turning it off right now, and I'm turning it back on right now. You'd be surprised how often that people will tell you that they've tried this already, and when you try it with them, it works. So to begin, we want to make sure that we are understanding the situation of what we're actually getting into, and the landscape of what our customers are actually working with. Um, our that kind of starts with our signal flow. Where is the path that our audio is actually traveling on? Um, what are we using? You'll want to like get a pen and paper, or a note. I personally use a notepad with a pencil because I make a lot of mistakes, so I tend to erase things a lot. You'll want to get an entire picture of the signal flow, gather as much information as you can, what type of devices they are, what kind of connectors, what's the input source connected to that. I mean, you want to get the entire audio chain, what kind of speakers are connected to the amp, which channels are those speakers connected to, how many speakers they are, if we are looking for a 70 volt type of system or low impedance speakers. Sometimes it helps to ask them what the brand of the speakers are, if they're all the same. Another thing that comes into handy is knowing the length of the actual cable runs, how far the actual wire is from the amplifier, because that comes into play a lot as well. Oftentimes people will cheap out on the wires, or they'll get wires based on a 70 volt system, even though they're going to be running them at 8 ohm, and at lower impedances you need thicker wires. So that very, very often comes into play. You want to know how everything is connected, what types of cables they're using, and we want to pay specific and special attention to unbalanced connections. We'll kind of go into the difference between balance and unbalance here, I think on the next slide, but pretty shortly here. And because it's a huge, huge, huge thing that causes a ton of issues, because most people don't understand the difference, and it becomes such a big and critical part of troubleshooting many of the issues that we run across. Another type of thing is to always keep in mind is to consider the application. Does everything that the customer is telling you make sense? We're going to look for things that sound strange because they often hold clues to troubleshooting. We're looking for situations like too many speakers on a run, more zones and amplifier channels. So if we have a 4-zone restaurant with a 2-channel amplifier, how are they doing that? How are they actually getting 4 separate audio zones? Because that doesn't really make sense. And I can tell you the ways that people kind of cheat to make that happen, and why that causes problems. We're looking for issues or situations where we've got 70 volt speakers with low impedance amplifiers that may or may not work, or weird things like using a tiny amp with a huge speaker. We generally don't see XLS amplifiers installed in stadiums for a reason. Okay, let me get you some calculators that I use all the time to figure out like what size cable you should be using, and voltage calculators, which we can kind of go over in a little while. Unfortunately, one of the biggest causes of people calling in is their lack of understanding of how unbalanced signals work with balanced amplifiers. Crown basically only makes balanced amplifiers, so it does become a big issue. I can give you a brief overview of how it works. So consider if you throw 2 stones into a pond, and ripples are created. Wherever those ripples meet, interference will happen. In some cases, the ripples will be in phase with each other, and that particular spot, the ripple will actually be twice as tall or taller than all the other ripples around it, or conversely, twice as deep inside of the valleys. And that's called constructive interference. Those waves are adding together and producing a bigger wave. The second part of that is the exact opposite, which isn't like a deeper wave. It's actually a flat wave where the two waves actually cancel each other out and make a spot where it's essentially level. Kind of want to point out how this works. So if you take two waves that have similar patterns and add them together, they create that constructive interference. So we can see how this is higher and lower. But if the waves are out of phase with each other, they cancel each other out and make something that's flat. And we can essentially use this to our advantage to determine whether or not we're, how we actually are connecting to the amp. And balanced connections actually use this to cancel out noise or interference that's provided or after the fact, like radio waves and such. So on a balanced signal, we have a positive, a negative, and a ground. The negative signal is the same exact signal as our positive signal. It's just inverted 180 degrees out of phase with the positive signal, and then sent out of the amp that way. Then once it's sent to the receiving device, that negative signal is then reversed so that it is now in phase with our positive signal, and they combine, and that makes the actual signal 6 decibels louder. It also has the benefit of dealing with any noise that is picked up by the line afterwards, like on radio waves, for example, like I was mentioning. That radio wave will actually be the same on the positive and negative wire. So whenever it gets inverted on the receiving device, now that interference or that noise is 100% out of phase with itself, so it gets canceled out. It's a pretty cool tactic, and that's why. And this allows balanced signals to be run much further than unbalanced signals. With an unbalanced signal, we don't have that negative. We just have our positive signal, or we call it hot, and our ground signal. And this is common with like an RCA. You'll also see this on like a 1/4 inch cable sometimes. I'll kind of bring in some pictures to kind of show you what I mean, where we can find some of these connectors. But the biggest thing to keep in mind is that when you get noise on a unbalanced signal, that noise still doesn't have anything to cancel itself out, so it'll still be there. And you can kind of see that here, that we have both the noise and the resulting signal kind of there in sync with each other, where with the unbalanced, with the balanced signal, we actually don't have that. And that leads us to stereo unbalanced connections. So where we've got things like a dual RCA or 3.5 millimeter, and this is anything you might find like a headphone output on your phone or on your computer. These are actually where a lot of our problems with going from balanced to unbalanced lie, is because people will think that that an unbalanced connection has a ground, not a ground, a negative, where in fact is that you actually have two positives. Essentially, this is what we're looking at here. We're looking at we've got two RCA cables, positive left and a positive right. Here, let me get a pen here. And customers will oftentimes connect these together. So they'll think that this is just one connection. You've got a red, a white, and a ground. So they'll take the red to positive, the white to negative, and the ground over to ground. And what this ends up doing is canceling out anything in the left and the right that are identical, because your receiving device is going to invert that negative signal. So anything that's common, like the vocal track, will always, pretty much always be in both the left and the right, is going to get canceled out. So if you ever get a call where somebody says, I've hooked up my audio source and all the vocals are missing or all the vocals are muffled, this is what's happening. They have gone ahead and connected the positive for left onto a negative source. Instead, what we should be doing is considering white as channel 1, and it gets its own ground. And then red, which should be right, that goes to channel 2, and it gets a ground as well. And then most of the time, you also want to make a jumper between ground and negative. This actually shows up in lots of different applications. This is one of the most common ways it happens, but it also happens with things like XLR to RCA, XLR to 3.5 millimeter, even XLR to 1/4 inch, depending on what you're working with. So, got a couple things I wanted to show you guys. So here we have an XLR to 3.5 millimeter cable. This is actually a very strange cable, and most of the time should never be used. But it's still pretty common. People will think that they can just grab this cable, plug it into their phone, and then plug the other end into the amp, and that's going to work. And a lot of times it won't. It depends on how that cable was wired, but assuming that it was wired straight through, where we've got our pin 1 is going to be our hot, pin 1 is our ground, pin 2 is our hot, and pin 3 is our negative or cold. That you're going to have that same exact issue where the vocals are going to be canceled out if you hear anything at all. But those cables, if they're purchased on Amazon or other retailers, they can be wired one of two ways. You can see here on the left, we've got your standard configuration where you've got your positive, your negative, and your ground. They're all separate and tied to a separate XLR pin. That will not work inside a computer or anything with a headphone jack. You're running into the same exact problem. The other type of cable is on the right, where it's an unbalanced connection, where essentially they've got the left and the right piggybacked on top of each other, and then the ground is just tied to pins 1 and 3, which should work inside of most of our devices or anything with an XLR port coming from a stereo source. But essentially, this is going to be summing that into mono. You're not going to get your separate left and right. Most of the times that's okay. It's just something to keep in mind. This balanced to unbalanced phenomenon is something that gives us tons of headaches, and you'll get calls and support emails on this every single day. I guarantee it. All right. Another thing to keep in mind is volume control. And when I say volume control, I'm talking about where the end user is actually controlling the volume for the entire system. Ideally, volume control should always be controlled using an input source rather than controlling the volume at the faders of the amp, like physically going up to the amp and turning up the channel one or the main fader for channel 1 and channel 2 is usually kind of a no-no and can lead to blown speakers. So we usually try to avoid that or encourage our customers to avoid that. Instead, you'll kind of want to have them practice gain staging. And the way I usually tell them to do it is you'll go to the amp, you'll turn the main gain faders all the way down. And then you go to your input source and you'll set your input source to its max output or the max output that you would run it at, whether that's 100% or 80% or 90%, it doesn't matter what, but if they know they're never going to turn it up past a certain level, then it's fine to do it that way. Otherwise, just have them set it to 100% or whatever the max level that doesn't distort at. Then have them start playing whatever their loudest content is. And I say that because a lot of content is mixed differently. These days we have what's called the loudness wars, where tracks are being mixed at a higher and higher level than they used to be in the past. So whatever they're like, I don't know if you have ever listened to Pandora and you hear the ads come on. The ads are always louder than your actual music. So whatever their loudest content is, their loudest track is, they want to play that. And then slowly adjust the gain on the amp up until it reaches the maximum level that they think they would ever use that system at. And then from there, they just use the input source to control their everyday listening levels. And this is the reason why this is good, is it prevents them from adjusting the amp too much and potentially blowing speakers. So I kind of consider this to be one of the safest ways to set up your system for a maximum SPL. Less ideal would be to use a fixed input level where they're not controlling the input but they're actually controlling the gain on the amp. But like I said, that can lead to blown speakers. So if they really want to do that, you want to make sure that they understand that. It is less of a problem though if you're running 70 volt speakers because of the way that 70 volt works. At maximum output, the amplifier will be outputting 70 volts, which then the transformers then of the 70 volt speakers will then transform down into a lower wattage. So it's less of a problem with 70 volt. 70 volt essentially has limiting sort of quote unquote built in because of this. For 8 ohm applications or low impedance applications, you'll want to use our limiter wizard with amps that have limiting available or configurable limiting. We do have some amps that have some limiting that's not configurable, in which case it doesn't really, there's not really much you can do there. But wherever we can, if they're going to control the main gain or the main volume level using the amp's gain knobs, we want to use limiters if possible. And let me go ahead and link that limiter wizard in chat here for you guys. In fact, I can even show you how that works too. So using the limiter wizard, we want to know 2 pieces of information. We want to know the impedance of the speaker, and we want to know the RMS power handling of the speaker. Sometimes they give you 2 separate numbers, like you'll get the 2 hour or essentially the short performance number, how much power the speaker can handle over a performance, and then the continuous number. which is the speaker is going to be playing basically 24/7, which is usually listed as a 100 hour. So assuming we have a 4 ohm, actually, why don't we just go ahead and look up a speaker? Let's say something like the SRX 815. I actually do this and Google it all the time. SRX 815. So found our speaker. We just kind of want to look for its specs. Okay, which are here. So we've got a 800 watt continuous number. We don't have a 100 hour rating on this, so we don't have to worry about that. We'll just use the 2-hour rating. 1600 watt program. Now, this, we want to keep an eye out. I mean, remember this later, but for setting the limiter, it's not really that important. We just need this continuous number and then the impedance, which is 8 ohms. Oh. Back to our limiter wizard. We have our 8 ohm impedance. And what do we say, 800 watts? Continuous. Yeah, 800 watts. And that tells us that our limiter needs to be set to 80 volts RMS. That's a pretty powerful amp, though. I mean, we don't have too many amps that can do that kind of output, but either way, that's essentially the same type of formula you would use every time. So if we were to then take that to Audio Architect so that we can actually configure that. Let's, yeah, DCI. We would open our limiter. And we can tell it that we want to set an RMS voltage of 80 volts. Turn your limiter on and you're good to go. Let's get that back up. Something that we never recommend is using inline volume controls on our amps. They are kind of the devil. I mean, I put that little note in there that they're the devil. They are oftentimes used to split one amplifier output into multiple zones. That's how, like I mentioned earlier, turning a 2-channel amplifier into 4 zones is kind of a no-no. The problem is that they're not really designed to handle the amount of power continuously that our amps can actually output. So most of them you'll see are like 35 to 50 watts. Every once in a while you run across the one that might do 100 watts, but I don't think I've ever seen one that does like 300 watts or 500 watts. And I don't think I necessarily want to be have that much power behind a switch that I can touch anyway. And generally speaking, whenever electrical stuff that has that kind of wattage has much bigger breakers and much more substantial switches than a small rheostat on a volume control. Okay. So since they're not designed for that kind of power, they tend to burn up. And when that happens, you get a lot of weird issues. Low volume, not able to control the volume at all. Sometimes the zone, that particular zone will go out and not be outputting at all. regardless, we just want to avoid those things. Anytime you see them, you'll want to inform your customer that we should not be using those. They will almost always end up in a service call, whether that's within a few weeks, a few months, or sometimes a few years if they're lucky. But they pretty much always fail. Okay. Another thing is we want to consider the application that this amp is being used in. When I go over the amplifier each amplifier group in session 2, we'll kind of cover which category each amp actually fits into. But you'll want to always consider how the amp was designed to be used. Because understanding the application can help with both troubleshooting and pre-sales questions. So the types of applications that we actually run into are small venue, large venue, cinema, public address, touring, and residential. When you're considering the application, the I/O should make sense. And if you're trying to pair a speaker with an amplifier, try to match the connectors wherever possible. So I know that I'm using my SRX 815. Then I want to find, and I know that it's got a speak on as its input. So I want to find an amplifier that has speak on outputs. That just makes it nicer for our customers, and makes it just a better experience for the end user or the installer whenever the connectors match, especially in PA and touring applications where they're constantly having to connect and disconnect these things. Like you wouldn't necessarily want to be connecting a speaker that's got screw terminals on it, in like if it's going to be moved all the time. But then again, screw terminals are just fine. You don't have to worry about expensive cables. You can run custom cabling in an install application where you just run essentially the bare wire. But yeah, I mean, even though you still want to, you'll always want to use this one wherever it's possible. You also still want to consider the alternatives. Um, a lot of times you run into speakers that have quarter-inch inputs. We don't have any amps that have quarter-inch outputs, but you can still get speakers or amplifiers or cables that will work between a speak on output or a binding post output, which is banana plugs, and then have quarter inch on the other side. So you'll also want to know the alternatives. This is another example of a time to know, as far as the inputs, where or keep the unbalanced to balanced thing in mind. If they're telling you that they have a Sonos Connect, which has got 2 RCA outputs on there, you probably don't necessarily want to recommend that they get a XLS amplifier. I mean, yeah, XLS or sorry, not the XLS, the XTI amplifier, because they only have these XLR inputs. The XLS would make more sense because it actually does have some RCA type inputs, and that makes it easier for the customer to install it. You also want to keep in, like, I just kind of want to touch again on the touring. Which can kind of include national acts, I mean, big bands that with big names, and rental companies. Those tend to be pretty vocal customers. They They're actually pretty good, pretty easy to work with because they usually know their stuff. But they're also pretty demanding, and sometimes they've got high dollar rigs. I mean, they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, so they expect kind of a different level of service a lot. So just kind of keep them in mind, and sometimes you kind of have to put on the kid gloves and make sure that you're kind of handling each type of customer appropriately. Like if we're dealing with a national touring venue, that has the potential to um, impact the company as a whole. Like if let's see, what's a big band? Something like Nirvana is on tour and they're using Crown amplifiers and having issues with our amplifiers, and Nirvana publicly comes out and says Crown amplifiers suck. That's going to impact the company. So just kind of keep in mind who you're speaking to and what you're dealing with when you're working with customers. If it kind of gets too big, don't be afraid to escalate that to someone like myself or Guy Minervini, or someone who is more familiar with answering and dealing with the larger and more vocal crowd, because we still want to make sure that we're presenting our best foot forward. Let's see. All right, now on to troubleshooting. So one of the biggest troubleshooting calls is no output. The number one cause of no output is no input. So first, make sure the amplifier is turned up. A lot of our
Can you hear me now?
Whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I was muted. I saw you got you got off your call, so how can I help you?
Ooh, I'm off the call.
No, you're still there. I think he got another call. Sorry.
No problem. Okay, number one cause of no output is no input. You want to make sure the amplifier is turned up, because a lot of our amplifiers ship with the volume floored by default, like the CDI Drive Core series, for example, ships with the by default at negative 40 decibels, which essentially is off. I get a lot of calls where people tell me no output, and it's just the amp is not turned up. And then you'll want to identify the input source. Kind of goes back to the things we wanted to keep in mind. Make sure you know what kind of input source they're using, what kind of cabling they're using, and if necessary, try a different input source altogether. Actually, trying a different input source is usually my go-to if people tell me they're not having, if they're having output problems. First, like I said, I'll check the volume, and then I'll immediately say, yeah, let's try another input source that is separate from the input source that we're using, and if possible, with different cabling. That way, we're using completely separate components to make sure that we're not dealing with a cabling issue. You'll want to check your signal level, especially with consumer sources. So I mentioned I would touch upon this before. The consumer input sources, they tend to be much quieter than the pro input sources, so it ends up causing issues where they will have low output, or the signal level so low that it appears that the amp is not playing anything unless they have the gains cranked, which most people are pretty reluctant to do. They will not turn the gains all the way up to 100% by default. They'll usually try to turn them up to like 60, 70%. And if you have a quiet input source, then you might not get anything out of it. Try a different amplifier if available, using the same input source and speakers. See if that works. If that works, then you're looking at a dead amplifier, and that just requires an RMA. Look for the output meters. Now, on the front of most of our amps, you have some indicator whether or not it's outputting. You'll usually looking for the dancing green lights. If you get those, if you get the dancing output meters, but you still can't hear anything, then it's probably not a bad amp. Most likely, it's going to be some sort of configuration issue or a bad speaker or bad cabling. Very, very rarely. It's extremely rare. I've been here for 4 years, and the number of times where I've seen output indicators but not had actual, but it actually been the fault of the amplifier that it's not outputting is 0. So it's extremely rare. Most of the time, if our amps aren't outputting, you won't actually get output meters. You'll get, it'll just be in like a not ready state or something. If you have a situation where it's like one output is working but the other is not, that's actually a really good problem to have, or a really good troubleshooting base, because when we have one output working, we know we have at least one good input and one good output. So what you can do is use that to your advantage. So first try swapping the outputs. First try swapping the inputs and see if the signal, if the issue follows the input, the working input. If it follows the working input, then you know you have an input problem, like that. Whatever your input device is not outputting on both channels for whatever reason. That will depend on the input device itself, but it gives us a starting point. We know for a fact at that point that both the outputs of the amp work and both the inputs of the amp work, because this input works on both channels and this and that works on both outputs. Now, if you try swapping the inputs and the issue stays the same, that also tells us a lot. It tells us that well, we still have our good known input, but now we want to try swapping our outputs to see if the issue follows the speakers or not. Now, if we if we swap our inputs and where the issue is now, stays, it tells us both of our inputs are actually good. I'm sorry. And the issue is going to be related to output. So either it's going to be a dead output on the amplifier or dead speakers or bad cabling. So at that point, we want to try swapping our outputs and see if the issue follows the speaker or stays on that channel. If it follows the speaker, then we know the amplifier is good. That we were able to get output on both sides of the speaker with that speaker that was known working. If it stays on that channel, then you probably have a dead amplifier channel at that point. You also, if you're also in that situation, you want to look to see if there's a ready light lit. If there's no ready light on that channel, there's a good chance that the amp is just asleep. So you'll go through the procedure to wake that amp up. Sometimes it's just a matter of rebooting the amp to bring out of sleep, and sometimes you might have to go and check to see if that channel is disabled. It just depends on the type of amp. We'll kind of go into that next during the next session, which I think we're going to do next week. A lot of times the amplifier will have a low Z and a high Z outputs that are separate, like for a JBL commercial series, for example. So if you're on the 70 volt output and you haven't turned on 70 volt mode, then you're not going to get any output from the amp, and you're going to be calling because you think the amp's not working, when flicking that little switch will actually make it work. One telltale cause of that, or at least a one telltale symptom of that, is if you move your speaker wires to the positive and negative and they start working, then that's probably what's going on, is they just haven't turned on the high Z switch to make sure the amp is in the correct mode. So no output, and we've determined that we actually have a defective amp, but we're not actually done. We still want to try to determine why the amp failed in the first place. A lot of times we can figure that out and get the amp repaired so it doesn't actually happen again. I mean, none of our customers really want to go through this multiple times, so having them know what's going to cause a failure is going to help everyone out. It'll help us out, it'll help them out. So things to look for as far as the failure mode is what kind of speakers. Like if they've got 5 speakers that are all 4 ohms each on a amp, on one amp channel, that's too low of an impedance. I mean, that's 1.5 ohms. Well, I have to look 8 divided by 5, but it's below 2 ohms, and that will actually cause the amp to overheat and potentially fail prematurely. We want to look for things like that. Or on a 70 volt output, let's see if I've got this one. On a 70 volt output, we want to look for things like low impedance. There's a lot of things out there that say that it doesn't matter how many speakers that you put on a 70 volt install. That's actually not true. Impedance does still matter on 70 volt systems, and we actually have a calculation for that. Which here Z, which is our total impedance, is going to be our E squared, which is our voltage. 70 volt systems. Let's open a calculator and we can show. Oh. So we have 70.7, which is the actual 70. We say 70 volts, but it's actually 70.7. We can multiply that by itself or square it. It's about 5,000. So if you want to round, you can just say 5,000 divided by P, which is the power of our amplifier. So if we have a 100 volt amplifier, or sorry, 100 watt amplifier, we would take this number, divide that by 100 watts, and that would give us our minimum impedance for that 70 volt line, which is about 50 ohms. So if you have a 70 volt amplifier that dies, have the customer check the impedance of that 70 volt line to make sure it's not too low, because otherwise, yeah, we'll go ahead, repair that amp, whether it's in warranty or out of warranty, it'll come back and then it'll fail again. Hopefully not quite as soon, but it'll fail again almost certainly. The other things to look for are bad environments, like amplifiers that are installed in outdoor locations. Look for things like under spec, like or overdriven amps. If you've got a 1500 watt speaker being driven by a 200 watt amp, then I mean that's obviously not going to work. You're at least not for most situations. We want to look for bad installation practices, frayed wires, especially on amps with screw terminals. I mean, I know I've personally done this where you're installing an amp with bare wire into screw terminals, and one of the little wires is frayed and touches another wire for like it touches the negative wire. So now you just created a dead short between positive and negative, and that will pretty much kill an amp instantly. So I pretty much always tell people and all my customers, if they're installing an amp or making any wiring changes, to turn the amp off, like unplug it if necessary. All right, another common problem, low output. We get calls on this every single day. Number one cause of low output is low input. Like with no output, you still want to make sure that your gain is at an appropriate level. That's pretty much always going to be a thing. And then you want to check your source input level. Crown amps usually want a source input of or input voltage of 1.4 volts to reach the maximum output level. And a lot of consumer devices, especially, don't actually achieve that. In fact, yeah, 1.4 volts is just what's necessary to get to maximum output voltage. But in an ideal world, you actually have more than that, more like 2 volts to 4 volts of source voltage. That way, you don't have to have any particular component turned all the way up in your audio system. A lot of consumer devices have a peak output level of 200 millivolts to 1 volt, especially things like Bluetooth adapters or home AVRs. It's really common, especially on the subwoofer output. I'm not really sure why that's the case, but subwoofer outputs are almost always 250 millivolts. And so people will call us saying, "Hey, I hooked up my sub to my amplifier, and this thing is really weak. What's going on? Why can't I get this thing louder?" And the answer is essentially you need to add a preamp. So there's a couple things that we use or that we recommend to resolve that, especially when going to consumer devices. So the first one that we recommend, I actually have a few of these here myself. I love them, is the ART CleanBox Pro. This is a preamp specifically designed to bridge the gap between Pro and consumer devices. It has RCA inputs and XLR outputs. You can use it on any amp that has an XLR input, like the XLS and the XTI series. You've got, for amps that have screw terminal inputs, like the CDI series, CDI drive core, DSI series, and the DCI amps, I usually recommend the RDL TX-LC2. This is less common. Usually people who are buying these amps actually have a Pro input source, but the CDI drive core and the CDI do commonly get used in residential installations. So I do still keep this one in my toolbox all the time. The only problem with this particular preamp is that it needs 24 volts DC input, and depending on where it's purchased, it may not come with a 24 volt DC adapter. So it's something you like, if you're going to recommend this, to tell the customer to that they may need to purchase a DC adapter separately, or buy it from a vendor that includes it. An easy preamp for us, I mean, this one is one that we make, is the JBL CSM 14 or CSM 28. I guess they're not really designed to work to be preamps per se. They're more mixers, but pretty much any mixer will work as a preamp. And some people just want to keep it all in the Harman family because they're a dealer and they just want something that they can order from one location, and this works pretty well for that. And if it's a situation where somebody needs to get something working today, most off-the-shelf type mixers you can find at like Guitar Center, Musician's Friend, Sam Ash, your local music supply store will work as a preamp, as long as it's got the right connectors, or they're willing to use the correct cables or the correct adapter cables, then that will work as well. That brings us back to our another reason why we have low output is inline volume controllers. When these things fail, they fail unpredictably, and one of the ways they can fail is in a partially open state or a stuck rheostat state where the adjustment doesn't work anymore, and it's just going to be at a fixed low volume. All right. Let's move on to distorted output. Distorted output is actually very rarely the fault of the amplifier. It can be, but it's not super common. The number one cause of distorted output is, once again, distorted input. You want to remove the input source and see if the crackling is still present with nothing connected on the input. If it is, then you may be looking at a defective amplifier. It's still really rare, but you'll still want to check with another speaker first. But usually if there's no input, you shouldn't hear anything at all. So you'll want to try another input source to see if you're still having distortion present. Another thing too is you'll have distorted input if the input's just like if its preamp is turned up too high. You've got another consumer audio device like a home AVR, and you've gone into the settings and turned the input gain up on that device as high as it'll go. Those preamps simply just can't handle that, and sometimes they'll distort and sound bad because of it. This is another situation where a preamp will help. Inline volume controllers can also cause distorted output, like crackling noises, static. Okay, we have muffled voices or crackling audio, and that can, once again, this brings up our balanced to unbalanced connection. If you get muffled voices, they probably, like I said, have their input wiring connected improperly. So you'll want to verify the way that they've got all their connections set up. This is really common on things like on things with screw terminal inputs, like the CDI and the CDI Drive Core series. Oh, another thing is summing their inputs properly. So I kind of need to go back a few frames to talk about it. Let's see if we can. Get back to that. Okay. So summing your inputs properly. A lot of times people will want to sum their system down to mono, their output down to mono, even though they've got a stereo input source. So they'll do something like this. We'll take our left positive and our right positive and take them both into channel 1, and then our ground over here. Now, this will probably work, but it's still kind of a no-no because it creates a situation where the voltage, the output voltage from whatever source device is being sent is going to be going back into itself. So essentially, it's sending signal from like the right positive into the output of the left positive, and vice versa. The signal from the left positive is feeding into the right positive. That can actually cause that device to get damaged, among other things. Can also cause phasing issues, potentially. I mean, it's less likely to have phasing issues, but it can cause phasing issues as well. If you're going to be summing, then there really should be a resistor in line. Let's clear this. There should be a resistor in line on both the positive connections. So essentially, you've got a resistor built in here that prevents audio from or voltage from feeding back. Let's get back to where we're at. Okay, so The other thing that where you get muffled voices and crackling audio is speaker issues, like blown drivers, specifically blown high frequency drivers. We are really sensitive as humans to the way human voice should sound, or human audio should sound, or vocal should sound. Like we know what it sounds like when a person what it should sound like when a person is speaking, and so especially in cinema applications, this actually comes up all the time where they actually might have blown drivers kind of across the board, or several blown drivers, but the center channel driver, which is where 99% of the dialogue is going to be played, might still be working, and they don't notice, because all that's in the left and the right is all your like explosions and your helicopter sounds, motorcycles. You don't really know what that's supposed to sound like. I mean, we all have an idea of what it sounds like, but if it's a little off, we just kind of chalked it up to creative decision if we can hear it at all. Like, wait, that motorcycle sounds a little weird, but maybe that's just how that motorcycle sounds, you know? Let's see. Poor wiring can also cause popping and crackling, especially with like underground connections or wires that are run in attics and such. Sometimes you'll have rodents that will chew on wires, and that can cause some crackling because now you're shorting the ground a little bit. If you're dealing with residential systems, underground subwoofers very commonly fill with water, and that makes it harder to vibrate them. It changes the impedance of the speaker load, and sometimes they don't it'll sound really bad, or just not work at all. Okay. Another type of troubleshooting call is for Audio Architect and Performance Manager. There's two active programs that we use to control, configure, and monitor Crown amps. They're Audio Architect and Performance Manager. There's also some older programs, System Architect, which is no longer supported. Customers will still commonly download System Architect, especially on some of our more mature products, like the CDI, DCI, XTA amplifiers, because the manuals still say System Architect in there as the programs to control them. They just haven't updated the manuals to change that particular word, you know. This is not worth it. Then lastly, there is Band Manager. Band Manager is also discontinued and unsupported, and really buggy inside of Windows 10. Sometimes you can get it to work, but we pretty much always recommend that our customers upgrade to Audio Architect or Performance Manager, depending on their application. Most of the time, we deal with Audio Architect. Performance Manager is more for like large venues, performance halls. Either way, you'll want to familiarize yourself with both of those programs. We do have training courses on both of them available, and I think you can find them all on YouTube. Here, in fact, I've got a link for one for them here. I did have links for them. Yeah, I'll have to post them later because I can't copy and paste right now. So usually customers who are calling about Audio Architect or Performance Manager have some idea of what they want to do. They're just having trouble connecting to the amplifier in the first place. In these cases, a lot of times, simply helping them get connected will be all you have to do. So we should kind of start there. With both of these programs, you'll want to check the network connectivity settings, which is under File and Application Options. So if we go to Performance Manager, File, Application Options, and then Network Connectivity. So Performance Manager only connects to IP-based amps. So that's all we'll see in here is Ethernet interfaces. We can add both Ethernet, wired Ethernet, and Wi-Fi type interfaces using this system or using Performance Manager. Cancel that. And then Audio Architect. Which is where we will stay for now. Application options, and then network connectivity. You want to make sure that your Ethernet interface that you want to connect over is actually in there. And then you also have the ability to control USB and COM port based amps, although we don't have any COM port based devices in Crown. That's mostly for BSS, the DSPs. So we're generally not adding COM ports, but we do want to make sure that we have two USB devices anytime we're connecting to a USB amp. The USB amps are the older CDI, DSI, and XTI/XTI2 amplifiers. If a customer ever calls you and says that the amp is not showing up, you want to make sure that this is the first place you usually want to look. Assuming all those are actually there, then we want to make sure that the network interface is on the same subnet as the amp, so that we're actually able to communicate over IP. And we'll do this in NetSetter. So both Audio Architect and Performance Manager have the ability to connect to NetSetter. You can also conversely just launch NetSetter separately, but in Audio Architect, you usually got a button right there in the middle. Click a big N. So when you're in NetSetter, the first thing you'll want to do is make sure that you're looking at the right adapter. So in the top left, we've got the PC adapter button. My adapter is this 192.168.1.199 address. So I'll want to make sure that that is correct. And I kind of set this up ahead of time, but we've got an amp here that's just showing as discovering because, well, I'm on the 192.168.1 subnet, but the amp is on the 192.168.50 subnet. Essentially, it's set as with a static IP, even though I'm on DHCP and we're not on the same subnet. So I can fix this one of two ways. I can add I can change this so that it's on the same subnet by manually adding an IP address for it, or I can try to put it on my DHCP or activate DHCP to see if it'll automatically grab an IP address from my subnet, which is what I'm going to do. One quick gotcha here, depending on the resolution of the screen and your scaling preferences or scaling settings in Windows, this apply current edits button might not be visible, but you'll always have to hit apply current edits before any changes will actually be made. So sometimes the quickest fix for that is to make sure that the customer hits the maximize button, and then it'll resize the screen so that they should be visible to them. So we hit apply current edits. Take a second. Oh, you know what? I don't think it actually did it. Edits. There we go. Okay, so my router gave it a new IP address of 1.205, and now, 1.184, and now it shows up as a DCI 4600DA and discovered. The other way you might do this is to open up your Windows settings and change the IP address of your PC adapter. So settings, network. Change adapter options. You'll go to properties, and then you can manually set an IP address. I won't do that because that'll kick us off the call. But essentially, you could have a customer change the IP address so that they can, if they're on site, they can talk to the devices on the network. If they know what their IP address is already, you can just pick something in that subnet that's not being used. Okay. Let's close these guys. The reason why this works, like why you can have an amplifier show up inside of Audio Architect as discovering, even though it's not technically on the same subnet, is because it operates on the OSI 2 layer, or layer 2, which is essentially sending communication over MAC address. So we can, it's very limited, but we can do some things like change its IP address, and that's exactly what we use it for. If you're still having problems connecting, you'll want to check your firewall settings. Oftentimes your Windows firewall is just blocking something, and you can temporarily disable the firewall. But oftentimes it's not your computer. Like it's going to be the network that you're connecting to. Or your network you're connecting through. So you can also try directly connecting your computer to the amplifier's Ethernet port and see if at that point you can make a connection. Actually is a really big troubleshooting. Like that's going to be one that you reach into in your toolbox all the time, is bypassing whatever network they're connected to that's already been pre-configured, and especially if there's any like managed switches or routers present. Manually connecting pretty much always works. Then also try another computer. A lot of people don't tell you that they're trying to connect through a Mac, and Parallels Desktop may or may not work. It's officially unsupported. Like if we get, I mean, you can sometimes get virtual machines to work, but it's often a pain in the butt, and a lot of times, especially with the USB amps, it's just impossible. Like because of the way that the driver communication between the amp and the PC actually works, it's just not going to work through a VM. Oh, ground loops, these are the fun ones. So ground loop hums are one of the more common types of troubleshooting calls we get. Usually a customer will think that it represents a problem with the amplifier. They can be barely audible or rather loud, but they're characterized by a low buzzing noise. You want to have them ensure that it's a low humming / buzzing rather than a high pitched hissing noise. A hiss actually is a different problem altogether. What you're actually hearing with a hiss is the noise floor of one of the devices on the system, whether it's the amplifier or something on the input chain, is just turned up too high. But one definitely common thing about ground loops is that they are very aggravating. Once you hear them, you can't unhear them. They, even if they're quiet, they since they're so low in frequency, they tend to be very personal. So if you have people frothing at the mouth, then they probably are dealing with a ground loop. Yeah, left unchecked. One symptom is uncontrolled anger. Many amplifiers have met the demise at the the hands of via baseball bat, dropped off roofs, thrown out windows, run over by vehicles because of ground loop problems that probably could be resolved. All right, so assuming we've identified the noise as a hum, then yeah, we most likely have a ground loop. Ground loops are caused by electricity wanting to flow in a path that we did not intend. Electricity wants to flow in a circuit from a higher electrical potential to a lower electrical potential source, or lower electrical potential destination. And sometimes this can cause it to go through our audio path. And what you're actually hearing is the frequency of the electrical grid. Here in the US, it's 60 hertz, but lots of places internationally, it can be 50 hertz, but it's always going to be 50 or 60 hertz. I don't think that there really is an electrical grid that works at any other frequency. Sometimes it can actually be twice of the electrical frequency. Like you can get a ground loop hum at 120 hertz or ground loop hum at 100 hertz, just depending on where you live. So since all ground amplifiers have a ground pin, sometimes a shorter electrical path to ground, which is the absolute lowest potential source or destination, the electrical signal will travel through our audio path and you end up hearing that because it's trying to get to ground through a way that we don't intend. Let's see. So should put together a little example of what we can do to fix your average ground loop hum. Go. All right. So I've chosen this example because it's actually the most common one that we get. We have a Crown XLS DriveCore 2 series amplifier, such as a 1502, and then your typical home AVR. This is a call like we get almost every day. Anyway, so with the home AVR, the most common thing that we see is that they don't have a ground pin on their power source. So you can see I've kind of blown it up here, but we've just got our line voltage and our neutral connection. Since we don't have a ground, when you connect your cables to something that does have a ground, like our XLS 1502, it is going to find, oftentimes the electricity is going to find a shorter path to the lowest potential source through our audio cables. And that's not always going to be the case. It'll depend on the specifics of like your electrical system, like how close you are to the neutral bus in your neighborhood, how the condition of the electrical wiring in your house, the condition of your ground rods in your that are tapped into your around your property that you're currently working in. Lots of things go into this, but usually the fix is pretty simple, at least in this situation. Essentially, all we want to do is tie or give them a common grounding point. So a lot of these AVRs will have a grounding lug for, which is just a little screw terminal here. I've kind of highlighted it here in red on the bottom of the Yamaha, where that's designed for just connecting the ground pin of your turntable. But we can make use of it for grounding this in this particular situation. The amplifier also has an easy ground. On our XLS, we've got our sleep and aux status port, which includes a ground pin. And that, if we can get a Phoenix connector, we can just take a simple wire and wire that to our grounding lug. Now, if the AVR doesn't have a grounding lug, then there's also another easy grounding point you can use. If it's got an AM/FM radio antenna port, like no one's actually, I don't know who actually uses those things still. Very few people actually ever connect the AM/FM radio to their AVR because no one actually listens to AM radio very commonly anymore. So we can usually just use the ground pin of that port. Now I've got a pretty blurry picture here. I couldn't find a more detailed version of this. So, but we can see on the Denon that top port is actually a ground port. So we can connect that as well to the ground pin of our XLS, and now we've given them a common grounding point. Other ways to do this are if you can pull off one of the chassis screws on the AVR or the amp, and more AVR and the amp, and then take a knife and peel back some of the paint on the amplifier and the AVR. The chassis on pretty much all electrical devices is always a grounding point, so we can use that to give them a common ground and alleviate ground loop hums that way. So lots of ways to do it, but essentially that's always what we're looking to do, is give all of our audio equipment the same grounding source. Usually though, it's going to be caused by something that gets directly plugged into the wall, but doesn't have a grounding pin. It is less common on things that work with a DC transformer. Like, so if you plug in, it's got like a Sonos Connect, for example, it will have like a 12-volt DC adapter. Well, maybe not the Connect, but the Sonos port, for example, has that 12-volt DC adapter. Things that have transformers that are external usually don't cause ground loops, but they still can. In which case, you still treat it the same way. Try to find a common grounding source. Assuming that you've tried grounding everything and you just can't get rid of the ground loop hum, but I mean that definitely does happen sometimes, but it's not super common. But if it does happen, you can still use things like ground loop isolators. We generally try to hold off on recommending those until unless it's as a last resort, because they tend to distort your audio signal a bit. They will tend to filter off the low end audio. So instead of using a inline ground loop isolator, they actually make ground loop isolators that will plug into, that will actually act at the plug and filter off ground noise that way. If you're going to recommend a ground loop isolator, make sure it's a quality one, because the cheaper ones will just tend to act as a low pass filter, or sorry, a high pass filter that completely gets rid of most of the low end, and we generally don't want that. Or a notch filter that just gets rid of frequencies between 60 hertz to 120 hertz, and yeah, again, that's gonna really impact the way our signal sounds. So I generally try to stay away from those, but where we're pretty much always able to figure out where the hum is coming from, and it's almost always something like a ungrounded consumer source to one of our grounded amps. Less common is if you're working with something using instruments, using a DI or direct input box or a stage box that includes what's called a ground lift. That might be the correct solution. It will literally remove the ground pin or the ground cable, and the circuit will just go through positive and negative, and that's what I'll use to actually complete the circuit. And that will that might actually be the correct solution. We usually don't have to do those types of calls because they're usually more input based. So I imagine guys like Soundcraft and the DBX and what's the other brand, Digitech, they deal with calls like that. But it's still good to know about it, just so you have some a frame of reference whenever someone calls you about this type of situation. All right. Last type of call is hardware issues for troubleshooting. It's important to know when we are actually looking at when one of our amps has failed. There's a few hallmarks that will most likely result in an RMA. If the customer is complaining about a fault indicator, that's almost always going to be an RMA. Or thermal lights. If you get thermal lights, you're going to want to check the speaker impedance, make sure that it's just not too low and it's not just actually overheating. If the clip lights are stuck on, these types of things can all cause, can all be hardware issues or be indicators of a defective amplifier. Although with those three, the false indicator, thermal lights, and clip lights, disconnect everything from the amp and unplug the amp, let it sit for at least 5 minutes. Longer is better. So 5 minutes, I usually tell people, call me, let it sit for an hour and call us back. And because often, even though it's a low likelihood, there is a chance that the amp will recover in that particular situation. If they get sparks, fire, smoke, or burning smells, then that's always going to be an RMA. And it should be obvious, but never recommend customers plug an amp in this condition. You should make sure that they unplug it, in fact, so it doesn't continue to remain a fire hazard. It's not super common, but it does happen. So just be ready for them. Oh, whoops. If a customer is complaining about no output, although they can see input in Audio Architect, it can sometimes indicate bad physical outputs, but you'll want to make sure you check the status of the ready light for the channels that they're trying to use. If the ready light is off, then you'll want to make sure that the amp isn't, one, asleep, or two, that amplifier channel isn't disabled. Like for example, I can bring in Audio Architect and show you like our DSI or DCI amplifiers will have the ability to disable an amplifier channel. In fact, I've got one. That one we found earlier. One. Okay, so this amplifier can actually have its outputs disabled. So as you can see now, the ready light for channel 1 is now off. And if I turn the output back enable, then it's going to be on again. Now, if it goes into standby mode, which we can adjust here, we can set the standby for each channel. That ready light will also turn off again based on the current standby state of the amp. So to turn that back on, then they would have to bring in signal into the amp to make sure, above that threshold level. And at that point, the amp will detect that signal and turn back on and become ready again. Assuming that the amp, that's not the problem, you can also try one of the built-in noise generators. So we go into our signal generator. We can turn the signal generator on. Turn our signal generator up, and yeah, at this point we should be outputting, but if there's an amp channel off, it'll look something like this. So even though we actually have input on channel 1, we can see that we're not getting any output, but that's because our amp is not ready. Okay. Once we turn the amp output enable back on, the signal comes back. But if that channel is ready and doesn't output, then yeah, then essentially that amplifier has an issue and needs to come back in for an RMA. This can happen sometimes on the DCI series, but we'll kind of go into that next week. Then certain error message will also be a good indicator about whether or not we're dealing with a hardware error or hardware issue, or we're dealing with a just something that's configuration based. But we'll kind of do a deep dive, and when we go into our deep dive, we'll talk about what kind of error messages result in an RMA versus just it being a basic troubleshooting call or something that's resolvable over the phone. I need to turn off my signal generator. No. All right, now we're getting into the pre-sale sections. Really, there's only two types of pre-sale calls. They all fit into two categories. We have the amplifier selection. People just want to know which amplifier to buy. Sometimes people will want to know which speaker to buy, but really that's more of a JBL question rather than the amplifier. Although you being a Crown Tech, you kind of need to know both. You almost need to know both because they kind of go hand in hand with each other. So it'd be a good idea to slowly research the types of speakers that JBL has and what kind of applications they get used for, so that you can make quick recommendations, or at the very end, if not necessarily to make recommendations, at the very least so that you understand the types of applications, or you can recognize whenever you've got weird applications going on. So let's start with the first question. What amplifier should I choose for this speaker? For that, we kind of need to know a couple of pieces of information. We need to know the impedance of the speaker, and we need to know the RMS wattage of the speaker. If the speaker has a program wattage, then that's also good information. Usually if it has a program wattage, we just want to choose an amplifier that has that wattage. But otherwise, we can go with RMS and try to double it. But that kind of leads us to the underpowered myth. So there is kind of I don't know what's the word for it, but essentially the idea that you're always supposed to have twice as much power as your speaker calls for. And that's true to a certain extent, because you would like to have some headroom, but having a speaker, I mean, your amplifier is not going to damage your speaker because the amplifier has lower wattage than the speaker can handle. What's going to damage the speaker is if you're trying to make the amplifier produce more power than it's designed for, and that causes it to clip. Clipping creates square waves, which is essentially DC voltage, and that will, I mean, speakers are not designed to play a square wave audio, so that will actually cause them to burn up and get destroyed. The other type of question we get is what amplifier replaces this old one? That's a really common one for the recently discontinued CTS series. I think those got discontinued around 2015 or so. And people call in saying, hey, this one died, what do I get? For that, we actually have the amplifier replacement guide, which I will bring up. So if someone says they have a CTS 600, you know, then we can look that amp up here. CTS 600 has been discontinued, and it's been replaced by the DCI 2x300. So it's pretty straightforward here. 1200, CTS 2000. The only kind of gotcha here with that one is the CTS 3000. The CTS 3000 has 1500 watts available per channel. So we don't really have a DCI that matches that really well. So it depends on what actual speaker they're using. So the DCI does 1250 watts, or we've got a DCI that does 2400 watts per channel. So which one of those you would recommend would be dependent on how much power the speaker they're using actually needs. Most of the time, the 1250 is going to be in the appropriate replacement there, but you'll want to keep you'll kind of want to know that you still also have the 2400 available. So if a customer calls and says they have a JBL, why don't we go ahead and choose one here? Yeah, why don't we go? Control 29 AV. That's a pretty common one that we got questions about. Control 29 AV. I will literally just open up this web page and go ahead and take a look at its specs. This particular speaker, it's actually a pretty good one because it has the ability to do both 70 volts or 8 ohm. So we want to make sure we know how they're going to use it. Okay, well, are you going to use it in 70 volt mode or 8 ohm mode? That's usually the first question I ask. If they're going to use it in 8 ohm mode, which would be likely if they were going to have 4 of them or so, or well, I guess less than 4 per channel, so 8 of them total, then it might be a good idea to just run them in 8 ohm mode and use an amplifier that doesn't have 70 volt capabilities, because adding 70 volt actually adds quite a bit of cost. I mean, the XTI and the CDI series, even though they're the same amp, the cost difference is actually pretty significant, simply because of the 70 volt capabilities of the CDI. So in this case, we'll say that they're going to run this at 8 ohms, and they give us a program power rating. So that's what we're going to look for. We're going to look for an amplifier that does 8 ohms, 300 watts. For which case we will bring up our power amp cheat sheet. I can send this to you guys. It's actually on our internal only for the, it's on our help documents, our knowledge base. Here. So we're looking for a 300 watt amplifier. And this is an install speaker, so we probably don't need a touring amplifier or PA amplifier, but we still want to keep them in mind. Sometimes a PA amplifier makes the most sense. They just, the PA amplifiers that have binding posts will also accept bare wire, so they will oftentimes work pretty well in install situations. So here we go. I want 300 watts at 8 ohms, so, here, that's a pretty good fit, the XLS 1502. So that would work. Another thing that would probably work as well would be the XTI 1002. They can accept bare wire connections and will work pretty well in a rack. If they're looking for a more budget-oriented option, the XLI series could work, but as you notice, the XLI series does not have 2 ohm ratings because they're not 2 ohm stable. So if you're going to go that route, then they couldn't use more than 2 of those speakers per channel on the amp. So just keep those types of things in mind. Then if they decide that they want to go 70 volt instead, then we just need to know how many speakers that they're planning on putting on the line. So with this particular speaker, the Control 29 AV, it's got 70 volt taps of 110 watts, 55 watts, 28 watts. So let's say that they're gonna install 20 of these Control 29 AVs. So we would just open up a calculator. And I usually try to use the biggest tap available. So that's 110 watts times 20. And that will be how much 70 volt wattage we would need if we wanted to drive this on one channel, all those 20 amps on the speakers on one channel, which is not realistic. Since we have 2 channels, we're better off going with a multi-channel amp. So if we do 110 times 10, that's still a lot of wattage for a 70 volt system. So 1100 watts. Do we have a amplifier that will do 1100 watts into 70 volts? Yes, we do. That would be the DCI 2x1250. So our 70 volt rating here tells us this amp will deliver 1,250 volts or watts into 70 volts. So that would be an appropriate amplifier for that application. Conversely, we could also go with the CDI 2x1200 because that's 1,200 watts into 70 volts. And both these would work because this is an install application. This speaker is going to be sitting on the wall. It's not going to be moved from place to place. So we're pretty flexible as far as what types of amplifiers we could use. Now, if we were going to go with a different speaker, let's go back into JBL Pro and look for something like a portable speaker. Well, it's pretty common. They got a PRX speaker. Or, no, never mind. These are all powered. All right, so the JRX lineup, we get calls asking about those all the time. So JRX 212. I'm a DJ and I want to take this around with me, and I need to know which amp to purchase for this. So it says 250 watts to 500 watts into 8 ohms. Now, we know a couple things. We know that they're going to be moving this around, so we want to consider that application. So considering they're going to be moving it around, we kind of want to see if we can find a picture of the back or the input plate of that speaker. Now, this speaker looks like it has both a speak-on input and a quarter-inch input. So we like seeing speak-on because that makes it easy for connecting and disconnecting. And we just need to choose an amp that's got a speak-on. So in this case, we want something between 250 watts to 500 watts and 8 ohms. And I'm going to bring up our power amp cheat sheet again. Oh, looks like I closed it. There we go. All right, so the XLI 2500 would be a good choice there. The XLS DriveCore 2 series, between the 1502 to the 2502, any of these 3 could work. The XTI series is probably more rugged. I mean, it's one step above, so very mature amp, and we sell a lot of these. It's probably one of our probably the most popular amplifier line that we sell. Although I think the XLS might be becoming even more popular, just because it's a bit cheaper. But the XTI 2002 would be appropriate, or even the XTI 1002 would be appropriate as well. And the reason why those would be appropriate is because they have the correct connectors on them. So we go and look at our XTI 2002. The back panel, we can see that we have speak on outputs. So it makes it easier from just grab a speak on cable off the shelf and they can connect their amplifier up. But you also want to ask them what are they using as an input source? Well, they're a DJ. They have a DJ controller, which is then connected to a mixing board, or some of them will just use the DJ controller directly out into the amp. Well, at that point, you'll have to look up that DJ controller and see what kind of outputs it has, whether they're balanced or unbalanced. That way, you can recommend a solution that actually makes sense for them. And if they're going to go balanced, just make sure that they know the risks of ground loop hums and how that they can alleviate them if they run into that sort of thing. But most DJ controllers, at least like the good professional ones, will have a balanced output, and it will not be quite so much of an issue. So if it's a balanced output, you've got, like I said, the option of going with the XTI series, or we can look at the XLI. Whoops. XLI 1500. Because it's got speak on outputs and balanced XLR inputs. And then we've got the XLS. What do we say? The XLS 2502. And I actually do this all the time, guys. Like I will literally open up Google, bring up a picture of the amp. I mean, you will eventually learn these kind of like inside and out and know these things. But even though I know these things pretty darn well, I still look them up all the time. So we've got our speak on outputs on this amp. It's got the appropriate amount of power, and it's got the appropriate inputs. We've got, in this case, we've got unbalanced inputs and balanced inputs, the unbalanced being the RCA. This link out is also an input. Like if they're all tied together, so you can use it for 1/4-inch inputs if that's what they've got. Just don't be turned off by the fact that it says out. But that's another cool feature of the XLS and the XTI is the ability to link amps together. So if you've got one input source that needs to drive multiple amps, you can just kind of daisy chain them together and be able to drive a pretty big system with only one input source without having some sort of distribution amplifier. I kind of want to take a break here and ask if anyone's got any questions on that, because that's a fairly common thing we've got to do, and I want to make sure I've covered it well. Just a moment. All right, well, moving on then. All right, so the other type of pre-sale question we get are power questions. they're going to be two kind of broken down into two categories. We've got our power draw questions, and then the other common one is using amps at different voltages. For power draw, these are usually for install applications. Contractors or consultants are trying to figure out how many amps that they can actually install on each circuit of their system, usually a 15 or 20 amp circuit. They want to know how much wattage is this thing gonna actually draw during day-to-day use? How much can I actually plan for? That way I know what kind of circuit that I need to provide to the customer or have the customer provide to me. So for that, pretty much all of our amplifier brands have a power draw and thermal chart. And we can go find one of those to so for example, for our XTI2 series, here we go, XTI2 power draw and thermal. It's almost always going to be, just look up on the product page for that amplifier. You can go to the download section, and it's usually somewhere near the bottom of the download section, the power draw and thermal chart. Although sometimes for some of our amplifiers, the power draw and thermal chart is actually inside of the owner's manual. There we go. So I click on that. Okay, so when we're looking at the power draw and thermal chart, it's going to be broken down into a couple different sections here. So we are looking at 120 volts, which is common in the US, and then 230 volts. Sometimes we'll also get 240 volts or 277, but usually this is more or less what we see. 120 volt at 60 hertz, 230 volts at 50 hertz, basically covering the US and then also international applications. So in the US, if I wanted to install this amp, I would need to know what kind of speakers I'm connecting to the amplifier. So if I know that I'm going to be connecting an 8 ohm load to every channel of the amp or a 4 ohm load to every channel of the amp, and I'm going to be running these amps at 120 volts because they're not changing to 240, then you would be able to just come under here, 120 volts. I have 4 ohm speakers per channel, so I know that this amp can draw, well, roughly draw 7.4 volt or 7.4 amps from the wall. But then these numbers are always both channel driven. So if they're only gonna be using one channel of the amp at 4 ohms, then you know that you can take this number and cut it in half. So it would be like 3.7 amps instead of 7.4. Oh, whoops, I was looking at the 1002. We actually need to look at the 2002 here. So 4 ohms per channel, be more like 7.5 amps. We also give this 1/3 pink power spec, which ends up being significantly higher. So if we were at 4 channel or 4 ohms, then this amp could draw up to 13 amps from the wall, 13.5 amps from the wall. But it's not really something I would recommend basing specs on. It represents an extreme clipping situation. That's where the amp is essentially going to be locked in clip mode for several seconds at a time, like just continuously. And usually the amps will throttle themselves before that situation actually arises. So it's really, I don't want to say it's irrelevant. It does come up, but it's not something that you build around. You build around the 1/8 power, and that's at just clipping. Like you're clipping occasionally, a couple times every few seconds or something, which is the more common way to use the amp. No one uses the amp, or no one should be using the amp where it's just locked and clipping constantly. And if they are, then they need to get a bigger amp. So you'll kind of want to keep an eye out there. When you're looking at a 70 volt application, so if we go and look up, for example, the CDI 1000, pretty common one. This will be installed, CDI series, CDI 1000. We're going to go find its power draw and thermal chart, which in this case is actually a Excel document. We get the same type of chart, but now we also have the 70 volt mode. And again, this is assuming both channels are driven all the way up to just clipping. In most applications, you're not actually even coming anywhere near clipping. So this is a pretty good spec to use that gives them plenty of headroom. So I would feel pretty comfortable installing 2 of these on a 20 amp circuit. Or you could even put 2 of these on a 15 amp circuit if you know that they're going to be using it for an application like background music, where it's probably not even going to output 10% of its power most of the time, or less than half of its power 99% of the time. So it'll be good in those applications. But at the end of the day, like you want to tell your customer, if they're not comfortable, then they should still consult an electrician. They can take these documents to an electrician and see what the electrician thinks. If they're not comfortable, like specifically specifically asking whether or not, or knowing whether or not this is how many amps I can stick on this circuit. So you can always get a professional involved. Because at the end of the day, this is not really up to us. We don't accept the liability of electrical issues. This is just more something that we have out there to help our customers. The second type of question is the using crown amps with different voltages. Oftentimes people will be buying our amps in one country here in the US and then shipping them overseas to like India or Africa or South America. I mean, we see it happen all the time, and then people will wonder whether or not they will work, or oftentimes what happens is they order the products and then order the products, ship them, and then when they don't work overseas, that's when they'll call us. But unfortunately, there's not a whole heck of a lot we can do when that happens. But we pretty much always recommend to buy the amplifier in the region that it's going to be used from one of the authorized dealers for that region, so that you get an amplifier that's guaranteed to work in your area. That said, we have several amps that do have universal power supplies. The anything like the XTI series, the DCI series, CDI series, those will all have universal power supplies, and you can kind of tell that if we look at the back of them. Oh. All right, so if we look at the back of the amp and we see a power indicator that says 120 volts to 240 volts AC, that would indicate that that amplifier has a universal power supply inside of it. And several of our our amplifier lines have that. It's usually just the cheaper lines that do not, like the XLS series. And I'll bring up one of those just to kind of show you what I mean. More budget-friendly lines. So instead of saying that it's 120 volts to 240 volts, it actually has got a little sticker or a little punch out determining which power supply is installed in this particular amp. A lot of people will look at this and get confused and think that it will work at 240 volts or 120 volts, and that's not the case. Also, depending on where they purchase it, sometimes looking on Amazon, for example, people like the Amazon listing might say that 120 volts, 240 volts, which is incorrect. But Amazon isn't an authorized dealer, so we really can't help them with that. I mean, we can try to help them out, but there's not much we can do about that. We again recommend everyone purchase the amplifier in the region they're going to use it from whatever authorized dealer is for that region. That will result in the best experience. They will actually be able to get service on the amp. A lot of our international dealers will refuse to service products that they did not sell themselves. So you really kind of want to stress to them that they want to buy it that way if they're looking at this, and if they're insistent on buying here and then shipping it, make sure that they purchase something with a universal power supply, essentially XTI, CDI, and higher. None of the budget equipment will do that. Generators, for a lot of the PA and touring amps, people will call and ask us if they can use a generator and what size generator that they need. I usually will try to refer them to the power draw and thermal chart, but yeah, absolutely anything with any of our amplifiers that have universal power supplies are absolutely fine to be run on generators. They generally have pretty good power power cleaning. They work pretty well under dirty power. So yeah, that's not a problem at all. And the 120 volt / 240 volt questions, that's more when that's more kind of common here in the US because we're the only ones that actually have the 120 volts for the most part. But a lot of people will wonder if they can stick more amplifiers on a 240 volt circuit. And yes, they absolutely can. The amplifiers will run at about half of the rated amperage at 240 volts, but that assumes that they have a universal power supply. Generally speaking, we don't sell 240 volt versions that of US amplifiers that don't have a universal power supply. Like we don't have a US version of the XLS 2502 that works at 240 volts. I mean, technically it exists. It's not sold here. They would have to purchase it from Europe and bring it back here. So it's not really a good option. Usually they're better off purchasing an XTI series instead. And I mean, it's not a really common thing that people will be looking to do, especially here in the US. But it's still good to know about it. Regardless, whenever you do run across one of those situations where somebody has purchased something in a region that is outside of the designated operating zone for that amp, or designated operating region for that amp, then what they can look for if they can't return the amp, which is usually my first option anyway, is to try to return it. But assuming they can't return the amp, they can use what's called a step-down transformer. Just make sure that it has the capability of handling the amperage that amplifier can actually draw. So you'll want to look for a step-down transformer that can handle 15 amps most times. Like so, if I've got amplifier designed to work at 230 volts, I'll get a step-down transformer, and in that case it'll be a step-up transformer. I'll step 120 volts up to 230 volts, and it should be able to handle 15 amps at 120 volts. Or if you go to if you take a US amp overseas and you've got 220, 230 volts, in that case, you want a step down transformer. You want to take that 230 volt output and turn it down to 120. and that will be a step down transformer. So step up and step down transformers will get those people out of a jam. You'll probably want to put that one in your toolbox. You're going to get this question sooner or later. It's one I would say we get it a few times a month. So it's a good one to kind of know about and stick in your toolbox. Anyway, I think that more or less covers everything that we were going to talk about today. I want to open the floor up for questions, and people feel free to unmute yourselves. And if you got any questions, now's the time to ask. I didn't get any from the chat. I couldn't see anything anyway.
No, it looks like it stayed pretty quiet.
Yeah.
Anybody have any questions?
I know there's a lot here, and we didn't get very, very specific into most of the things, but now's kind of a good chance to ask any specific questions. Here we go. We got a question. Connecting the amps with USB with Audio Architect. What specifically, Randy?
You can unmute, Randy, or I'll unmute you.
Yeah, I hit unmute all.
Okay.
I'm on mute. Just had a question on sometimes that seems to be a problem with connecting to Audio Architect with USB. Sometimes it doesn't see the amps,
Mm-hmm.
or you have to go into the settings and is the amps is Audio Architect by default supposed to see the USB? I mean, is there a procedure of which one should be on first? That's
Yeah,
kind of my question.
by default, yes, Audio Architect should see amplifiers, USB amplifiers without any real modification to the program, but that's a should. Like every once in a while, you still have to manually add the USB devices. So you kind of want to go into your application option settings here and look at this USB devices under network connectivity. You should have 2 devices in that particular region. So if you see 2 devices, I mean, if you don't see 2 devices there, then you'll want to go to add connection. There we go. So let's just remove it so we can see what that process actually looks like, because it's a little weird, but add connection takes a few seconds on my machine. And you'll select the first one, and add connection. You'll go to add connection again. Select the second one, hit add connection, and you should be good to go once you hit OK. At that point, when you're in the offline mode, if there's a USB device attached, Audio Architect should be able to detect it. Now, if it doesn't detect it at this point, there's probably one of 2 things going on. You want to ask to make sure they're not using a virtual machine. Like a lot of people, like a lot of callers will call in there. They'll connect you, or do a remote session with you through a Mac, or they'll be connecting through you to the amplifier through a Mac, and that just won't work. Like I've seen a couple people be able to make it work, but it's not reliable. I want to say 90% of the time, 95% of the time, you just can't get it to work. I don't know what settings are actually necessary to make the USB pass the amplifier through properly. They'll have way better luck with Boot Camp than they will with like Parallels Desktop or VMware. The other possible issue is if the amp has really, really old firmware, in which case you're going to use the C-Loader tool to give them the update manually, or force the update into the amp with another application. And we'll kind of go over that next week. Because it's a rare call, but it does come up every once in a while. It comes up often enough that you should know about it. Does that answer your question? Yes, Kenny, I'll give you, I'll hand out the PowerPoint, and it's actually recorded as well.
Yeah, so all this information will be on a knowledge base article within a couple days. There's a little bit of process to it, but we'll have it all posted.
Okay. Hi, many quick question to you. It's Glauco
Sure.
from Brazil.
Hey, how's it going?
About Loader to update XTI 1000.
Mhm.
The correct version is the 2.19.
I think so. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And for XTI 6000 is the 2.25, or the same 2.19 will work.
I think 2.19 works. It's just you have to make sure you have the right version of the firmware. So with the XTI 6002 in particular, or 6000 in particular, it's not the same firmware as like the XTI 1000.
Yeah.
They actually have completely separate firmware files. So you never want to add the 6000 firmware to a 1000, 2000, or 4000 amp, and conversely, you don't want to add the 1000 firmware to a 6000 amp. Otherwise, yeah, it's bricked. Like I don't think it's actually recoverable. So you want to be very, very careful with that.
Okay.
Yeah, good question, but that's yeah, kind of something we don't see super often, but we have run into it in the past. I want to say over the past 4 years, I've probably run into that like 2 or 3 times with the 6002 or the 6000 version.
Yeah, I have to update XTI 1000. That has a problem. The customer forgot the password.
Yeah. Yeah, if you forget the password on the XTI because of access control made with System Architect or Audio Architect, then yeah, you have to flash the firmware.
All right. Any more questions? Gone a little bit over, but got anything else? Okay. Well, I'm going to stop the recording and guess we'll wrap this one up.
Yeah, I mean, feel free, guys.